Mikhail stood in the frozen silence of the Krasnoyarsk region, his breath crystallizing before his face in geometric fractals. Beside him, his younger brother Dmitri ran gloved fingers across a photograph, aged, waterlogged, but unmistakable. It showed the same mountain ridge they were now standing beneath, and at its peak, something that didn't belong in nature. A shape too geometric, too intentional to be coincidence, a statue, an idol. 3 weeks earlier, their grandmother's house had yielded its secrets. While clearing the attic before selling the property, Mikhail had found a leather journal wedged between wooden beams, untouched for possibly decades. The handwriting was their grandfather's, sparse, precise, military. He had been a geologist in the Soviet era, stationed in remote regions, and the journal documented his discovery in 1967. An ancient carved figure, half buried in glacial ice on a peak no one had officially mapped. He had photographed it, sketched it, written coordinates in fading pencil. He had never returned. He never spoke of it. He died thinking no one would ever know, Dmitri had whispered, turning the pages with reverence. The journal contained measurements, astronomical notes, sketches of peculiar symbols carved into the idol's base. And there was something else, a fragment of pressed cloth, darkened with age, that their grandfather had labeled in Cyrillic, pigment sample, unknown origin, temperature reactive properties, date, 23rd of July 1967. That fragment had changed everything. Their grandfather wasn't a man prone to mysticism or exaggeration. If he noted something, it was real. They had consulted quietly with a mineralogist friend, who identified the pigment as an ancient ochre compound, mixed with compounds from iron oxide minerals found only in specific regions of Siberia. It was a formula that predated recorded Russian civilization, perhaps by centuries. Now, standing at base camp with their equipment arranged in neat piles, climbing gear, thermal cameras, sample containers, a satellite communicator, Mikhail felt the weight of the discovery pressing down like the cold itself. Above them, the peak rose like a fist clenched against the sky, its slopes a geography of danger, crevasses hidden beneath snow, cornices that could collapse under body weight, temperature drops that could kill within minutes. The full moon would rise tonight. According to their grandfather's notes, it was essential. The idol's properties only manifested under specific conditions, below -40 degrees Celsius, high humidity from rising ice vapor, and the particular quality of full moonlight reflecting off virgin snow. "We climb at sunset," Mikhail said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We document everything. We leave no trace except what we need to prove it exists." Dmitri didn't respond immediately. He was the worrier, the cautious one. He had wanted to bring a larger expedition, to involve the authorities, to do this properly. But Mikhail knew better. In Russia, official expeditions meant committees, bureaucrats, delayed permissions, and eventually someone else claiming the discovery. No, this would be theirs alone. A final gift from their grandfather, carried in silence across 50 years. The wind picked up, carrying that particular Siberian bite that doesn't just chill skin, but seems to penetrate thought itself. Mikhail secured the last of the rope to the sled. They would move quickly, climbing the exposed southeast face where their grandfather's notes indicated the safest approach. The moonrise would catch them near the summit ridge. If their calculations were correct, if the ancient painter had positioned the idol to catch the moon's angle precisely, they would witness exactly what their grandfather had seen, the idol's surface seeming to weep rust-colored drops, as the ancient pigment reacted to the massive temperature differential and the moisture rising from the ice. The photograph their grandfather had left was yellowed almost to invisibility, but Mikhail had studied it so many times he could see it with his eyes closed. The idol's face was neither human nor animal. It was something older, something that spoke of a time when art and ritual and mathematics were not separate disciplines. It was waiting. Dmitri began his pre-climb ritual, checking and rechecking equipment with the precision of a man who understood that mountains do not forgive carelessness. When he looked up, his eyes reflected something Mikhail hadn't seen in years: purpose. Whatever doubts his brother harbored, they were being buried beneath the weight of their grandfather's unfinished story. The sun was already beginning its descent, painting the eastern face of the peak in shades of amber and shadow. They had perhaps 6 hours until the full moon rose. 6 hours to reach the idol, to document it, to understand what their grandfather had discovered and then, inexplicably, abandoned. 6 hours before their lives changed in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Above them, the mountain waited. The idol, patient and ancient, watched the light fade. The brothers secured their final supplies, tested their radio frequencies one last time, and turned toward the slope. Behind them, base camp would remain empty, a silent witness to their ascent. Ahead, the ice and cold, and the mystery of 50 years called them forward. The climb was merciless in the way Siberian mountains are merciless, not with dramatic fury, but with relentless grinding difficulty. By the time Mikhail and Dmitri had gained the first 1,000 meters, their lungs were burning in a way that cold air alone could not explain. It was the altitude, the exertion, the weight of expectation carried in their packs alongside pitons and rope. The face was steeper than the photographs had suggested. Grandfather's notes were precise about coordinates, but vague about the actual climbing difficulty. Perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps he wanted to preserve the memory as something intimate, knowable only through experience. Or perhaps, after 50 years in the Siberian wilderness, details had eroded from even his careful documentation. Mikhail established anchor points, while Dmitri belayed, their movements synchronized from years of climbing together as teenagers, before life had pulled them in different directions. Mikhail worked in Moscow now, in financial analysis. Numbers, algorithms, abstractions. Dmitri had stayed closer to nature, working as an environmental surveyor, but here, roped together on an anonymous Siberian slope in gathering darkness, they were brothers again, trusting each other's judgment with the weight of their bodies. It was Dmitri who spotted it first, a thread of color against the grey-blue ice, perhaps 50 meters above them on the face. He pointed, and even through his goggles, Mikhail could see the slight nod of acknowledgement. They increased pace carefully, mindful that speed and safety on a mountain face are often enemies. As they drew closer, the color resolved into definition. It was pigment, rust red, ochre, a shade that seemed almost warm against the glacial cold surrounding it. It marked the rock face in a pattern that could not be natural. Curved lines, deliberate striations, something that suggested intentional placement rather than geological accident. It was barely visible, worn nearly flush with the stone by countless winters, but it was unmistakably there. Mikhail removed his outer glove, a dangerous decision on a mountainside, but necessary, and placed his bare fingertips against the pigmented stone. The cold was immediate and absolute, but beneath it he felt something else. A subtle texture, slightly raised, as if the ancient artisan had layered the pigment thickly, deliberately creating depth. He could feel grooves, what might have been symbols or writing. His fingers were already beginning to burn with cold. "Can you see it clearly?" Dmitri called from below, his voice distorted by wind and distance. "It's a marker," Mikhail called back, already preparing to continue climbing. "A guide mark. The idol is above us. It has to be. Grandfather wouldn't have left markers unless the main chamber or structure was—" A sound interrupted him. Not a large sound, just a sharp crack, like an ice shelf shifting. But in the mountain's language, it was a warning. Both brothers froze. In the gathering darkness, with the moon not yet risen but its light beginning to glow along the eastern horizon, visibility was treacherous. They could not see if the sound indicated a crevasse opening above them, a cornice weakening, or simply the normal groaning of ice under its own weight. "We anchor here," Mikhail decided. "We wait for moonlight. The face is becoming unstable." Dmitri didn't argue. His brother's instincts had always been reliable in moments like this. They drove pitons deeper than usual, secured their rope to a bomb-proof anchor configuration, and settled into the weight. The wind picked up, and with it came something else. A change in temperature. Mikhail's instruments showed it dropping, -38 degrees, -39. The moisture in the air was increasing as they climbed higher. "Do you think he saw this marker?" Dmitri asked, his voice small against the wind. "Grandfather? He must have. He wouldn't have left coordinates unless the path was marked. Then why didn't he continue? Why didn't he reach the idol?" Mikhail didn't answer immediately. That question had haunted him since finding the journal. Why would a man who had risked so much to discover this place abandon it before reaching the summit? Why would he never speak of it, never return? Behind them, unseen, the full moon was rising, massive, pale, rising like the eye of some ancient witness watching the brothers approach. In another hour, it would clear the ridge. In another hour, the mountain would reveal its secrets, and high above them, on a peak that had been waiting half a century for human eyes to return, an idol carved by hands that had turned to dust began to feel the particular quality of moonlight that awakened its ancient paint. Something was shifting. The brothers could not see it yet, but they could feel it in the way the wind changed direction, in the quality of light beginning to transform the darkness, in the mountain's slow adjustment to the moon's rising influence. They were close now, close enough that something, instinct, blood memory, the simple physics of their presence on the slope, was resonating with the presence they had come to find. The moon rose like a promise kept. First as a pale glow on the eastern horizon, then as a crescent, then as the full, massive presence that transformed the Siberian night into something entirely new. Mikhail and Dmitri felt the temperature drop precipitously as the moonlight intensified, their instruments now reading -42 degrees. The cold at this altitude and this hour was approaching the limit of their equipment's tolerance. They began climbing again, and now the world was monochromatic and dreamlike. Every surface reflected the moon's light in subtle gradations of silver and shadow. The wind had calmed to an occasional gust, and in that relative stillness, both brothers could hear the crystalline singing of ice, that high, almost musical sound that occurs only in extreme cold, when frozen moisture resonates with thermal stress. The face became gentler as they climbed higher. The gradient shifted from nearly vertical to something approaching a steep slope, and then, between one moment and the next, the slope opened into a wide, sheltered cirque, a natural amphitheater carved into the mountain's face by millennia of ice and rockfall. And there, positioned at the cirque's center, catching the full moon's light like a focus point, was the idol. It was smaller than Mikhail had expected, perhaps 1.5 meters in height, but its presence was immense. The carving was crude by modern standards, but sophisticated in its own language. The face was abstract, a broad forehead, deep-set eyes that seemed to stare downward into the cirque, a mouth that might have been meant to smile or to scream. The body was simplified, almost columnar, but the base was covered in symbols, spirals, lines, what might have been astronomical notation or hunting records. The entire figure was carved from a single piece of grey stone that had been brought to this place by hands that belonged to a civilization the brothers could not name. And the idol was bleeding. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Where the ancient ochre pigment covered the stone, particularly concentrated around the eyes and mouth, a faint reddish liquid seemed to be seeping. Under the intense cold and the specific angle of the full moon, the ancient paint was reacting. The complex mixture of iron oxide, mineral compounds and binders used by unknown artisans had been formulated precisely for this, to respond to specific environmental conditions, creating an effect that would have seemed miraculous to ancient observers. To witnesses of faith and ritual and limited scientific knowledge, an idol that wept under the full moon would have been proof of divine presence. It would have been proof that the gods were listening. Mikhail approached first, moving slowly across the cirque floor with the reverence of a pilgrim entering a temple. His thermal camera recorded everything, but the camera was secondary now to the simple act of witnessing. He could smell the ice, sharp and clean, and beneath it something else, a mineral scent, like rust exposed to moisture, like time given physical form. The idol's painted surface was cool to his touch, and yes, there was moisture there, the pigment's chemical reaction to temperature differential and humidity creating a faint, cold weeping, not blood, but close enough to fool people in darkness, close enough to inspire mythology. Dmitri had unslung the sample kit and was carefully collecting fragments of the pigmented material, sealing them in preservation containers. His hands were shaking, from cold, from emotion, from the weight of standing before something that their grandfather had seen half a century ago and kept secret. "Why do you think he didn't tell anyone?" Dmitri asked quietly. It's incredible. It's proof that civilizations we know nothing about existed here. It's everything an archaeologist or historian would dream of. "Because they would have taken it," Mikhail replied. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere he hadn't known he understood. The Soviet government in 1967 would have claimed it, removed it, studied it in some archive where it would eventually be lost to bureaucracy and time. Grandfather understood that. I think he understood that some discoveries are meant to be kept rather than shared. Some knowledge is sacred specifically because it remains hidden. The full moon continued its arc across the sky, and the idol continued its ancient weeping. In the distance, across the darkness toward the east, they could see nothing but the vast emptiness of the Siberian night. They were alone, truly, completely alone, in a way that modern life rarely permits. The pigment is designed to do this, Mikhail said, understanding flooding through him. It's not random. Whoever created this idol understood chemistry we only recently rediscovered. They positioned it to catch the moon at precisely this angle. They formulated the paint to react at specific temperatures. This wasn't magic, it was sophisticated engineering, masked as divinity. Dmitri looked at his brother, then back at the weeping idol, then up at the moon. Understanding crossed his face as well, that particular understanding that comes when a mystery resolves into something simultaneously more complex and more beautiful than the mystery itself. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The brothers set up their equipment to document everything that the night would reveal. They were no longer just climbers. They were witnesses to history, carriers of knowledge that had been waiting a lifetime to be rediscovered. And the idol, ancient and patient and exactly as their grandfather had left it, continued its quiet communion with the moon above the frozen peaks of Siberia. The night deepened, and with it came clarity. Mikhail and Dmitri worked methodically, photographing, measuring, sketching the symbols that covered the idol's base. The full moon provided enough light to see detail, though their thermal imaging equipment and flashlights with red filters helped preserve their night vision and avoid disturbing the scene more than necessary. What they discovered was a chronicle, not a linear narrative like written language, but a record nonetheless. Spirals that seemed to represent cycles, seasons perhaps, or years. Linear marks that might indicate counting or astronomical observation. Animal figures, deer with elaborate antlers, possibly indicating hunting importance or spiritual significance. And water symbols, curves and waves that suggested rivers, rain, or the deep importance of flowing water to the culture that had created this place. Dmitri photographed each symbol with methodical precision, while Mikhail sketched interpretations into the field journal. They were not archaeologists, not professionally trained in reading ancient art, but they understood pattern recognition. They understood that someone, millennia ago, had taken enormous effort to create this marker on this peak. That meant something. That meant the location was sacred, significant, or marked something that needed to be recorded for future generations. "Look at these marks," Dmitri said, pointing to a series of deep grooves on the idol's western face. "They form a kind of calendar. If these are lunar months, 13 of them, see? 13 marks, then a deeper groove, then 13 again. That would be, what, 2 years? Multiple years." Mikhail leaned closer. The symbolism was beginning to resolve in ways that felt almost obvious once noticed. This wasn't abstract art for decoration. It was data, preserved in stone, because stone endures when everything else crumbles into dust. Someone was recording time itself. "There's more," Dmitri continued, shifting his focus to the base. "These symbols here, they might be migration routes. Look at how they converge, then split, then converge again, like tracking movement across geography. The brothers worked through the night documenting, photographing, taking rubbing samples that might later be analyzed. The idol continued its subtle weeping, the ancient pigment responding to the moon's light and the extreme cold. Mikhail realized that this effect, this bleeding, had been intentional. An ancient artist had created a sculpture that seemed to undergo a transformation under specific astronomical and climatic conditions. It was a kind of message across time, a signal that would wake up, activate, become meaningful only when conditions aligned properly. A civilization that understood that time itself was cyclical, that the same conditions would eventually return. But as the hours progressed, Mikhail became aware of something else, a subtle awareness that was less about what he was seeing and more about what he wasn't seeing. The cirque seemed isolated, protected, but there was something beyond it. Something in the darkness past the rim of moonlight. He kept noticing movement in his peripheral vision, shapes that resolved into nothing when he looked directly at them, likely just the cold affecting their perception, but still. "Do you feel watched?" Dmitri asked suddenly, voicing the thought before Mikhail could. "The mountain," Mikhail replied, but even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. They were not alone. The certainty of this crystallized as the night deepened. Someone else was on the peak, not immediately close, but present and aware of them. The brothers exchanged looks, careful, calculating. They had broadcast no information about their destination, had left minimal digital footprint, yet somehow, impossibly, they had been followed. Or perhaps, Mikhail thought with creeping unease, there were others who also knew about the idol, others who possessed their own fragments of knowledge, their own reasons to be here on this particular night, under this particular moon. "We finished the documentation," Mikhail whispered, though there was no logical reason to whisper. Sound carried strangely in the Siberian cold. "We pack everything secure. We don't acknowledge anything until we know what we're dealing with." Dmitri nodded, already moving with practiced efficiency to secure their equipment. The sample containers were packed deep in their packs, carefully labeled and protected. The photographs, the sketches, the measurements, all preserved. The full moon continued its arc across the sky, and the idol continued its ancient vigil, and in the shadows beyond the illuminated cirque, something shifted. The brothers moved closer together, professional paranoia giving way to genuine concern. They had come seeking history. They had found it. But in the seeking, they had apparently announced themselves to others who also wanted to find what the mountain had kept secret for so long. The figure emerged from shadow at the eastern edge of the cirque, silhouetted against the moon. Not aggressive, not yet, but absolutely present. The brothers froze, hands on their climbing gear, ready to move but not willing to make the first aggressive action. The figure raised one hand, clearly visible, clearly meant to communicate non-hostility, or at least a desire for negotiation. "Don't move," the figure called out in Russian, his accent marked but fluent. As he approached, details resolved. An older man, perhaps in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent significant time at altitude. Behind him, two younger climbers, similarly outfitted, similarly purposeful. Not casual explorers, not tourists. This was a planned expedition, carefully resourced. "We mean no disruption," the older man continued, moving into the moonlight with careful steps. "The idol has waited a long time for visitors. There is room for shared understanding." Mikhail stepped forward, placing himself slightly ahead of his brother in a posture that was not quite threatening, but made clear he was the primary decision-maker. "Who are you? How did you know about this location?" The older man smiled. It was a sad smile, full of weight and history. "I am Dr. Alexander Kolyakov. For 30 years, I have been tracking the history of the Chulim people, a civilization that predates recorded Russian history by perhaps 2 millennia. This idol is one of their sacred markers, a repository of knowledge about their culture, their astronomy, their understanding of seasonal cycles." He gestured to his companions. "These are my graduate students. We have been searching for these markers for years. I received information that someone else had discovered this location. I had to see for myself." Dmitri stepped forward now, standing beside his brother. "How did you receive information? This discovery is—" "Fresh," Kolyakov interrupted gently. "Yes, your grandfather was careful, but he was also known in certain academic circles. Before he died, he spoke to a colleague about his discovery. That colleague was my mentor. It was mentioned to me years ago, but I had no solid coordinates until very recently. Our grandfather never published," Mikhail said carefully. "Never spoke publicly." "No," Kolyakov agreed. "He understood that some knowledge is dangerous. The Soviet government would have seized this, destroyed it, or hidden it in some archive. That was his ethical choice, to keep silence rather than allow institutional corruption of the discovery. I respect that choice. I have attempted to honor it." One of the graduate students, a young woman with the precise, nervous energy of an academic, stepped forward with a thermal imaging device. "If we're permitted, we would like to document the pigment reaction. The chemical composition is unprecedented. To understand how an ancient civilization formulated paint that responds to specific temperature and light conditions." "The bleeding effect," Dmitri said. "It's not miraculous. It's chemistry." "Exactly," the young woman replied, her face lighting up. "But the sophistication of that chemistry is extraordinary. They understood oxidation processes, crystalline structure, the precise formulation of compounds. This isn't crude, this is advanced engineering, and it's from a civilization that supposedly didn't possess written language or recorded scientific knowledge." Mikhail watched the interplay carefully. These were genuinely scholars, genuinely passionate about understanding the past. But they were also outsiders. People who wanted to claim and study and perhaps ultimately remove what the brothers had come to find. "The idol stays here," Mikhail said quietly. "This is a sacred place. This is a message left for specific people to find at specific times. If we remove it, we destroy the entire meaning of why it was created." Kolyakov nodded slowly, as if he had expected precisely this response. "Wisdom," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud, but the knowledge, the fact of its existence, the understanding of what an ancient civilization was capable of, that should not remain hidden. That should become part of human understanding, even if the idol itself remains untouched." "How do we know you won't come back with official teams, with authorities?" Dmitri challenged. "You don't know," Kolyakov said simply. "You have to trust me. You have to believe that someone who has dedicated his life to understanding the Chulim people would not destroy them, by exposing their sacred places to bureaucratic defilement. I ask only for photographs of the symbols, samples of the pigment if they can be taken without damaging the idol, and the coordinates so that I might record this location in my research." The brothers exchanged glances. The moon continued its arc. The idol continued its quiet vigil, bleeding its ancient tears under light that was ancient when the artist's hands carved the first mark into stone. Mikhail made a decision. "We document together," he said. "Your photographs, our measurements, our data combined. But we do not publish. We do not reveal location. And we do not allow removal of anything that is part of the idol itself. What we take is only what the idol wishes to give. Perhaps some of the pigment that naturally sheds, perhaps rubbings, but nothing more." Kolyakov's face transformed into genuine gratitude. "Agreed. You are wiser than I anticipated. The mountains, it seems, teach lessons that books cannot. And so, under the Siberian moon, 5 people who had arrived as strangers found themselves united in the simple act of witnessing history, of respecting something that transcended their individual desires or ambitions. The idol stood at the center of their circle, weeping its ancient tears, and in its silent presence, something older than conflict, older than ego, seemed to settle over the cirque like a blessing. The collaborative documentation continued through the remaining hours of darkness. Mikhail and Dmitri worked alongside Kolyakov and his students with the synchronization of people who understood that they were engaged in something that transcended personal ambition. The full moon gradually descended toward the western horizon, and with it, the idol's weeping effect gradually diminished. As the angle of light changed, the pigment's chemical reactions slowed, the faint reddish seepage becoming less pronounced until, as the moon finally touched the ridgeline and began to disappear, the idol returned to being what it appeared to be during daylight, simply an ancient carving, remarkable but not miraculous. The temperature, which had climbed slightly as dawn approached, was now beginning to drop again as the sun rose. Both effects would accelerate once daylight fully returned. The cold that the brothers and scholars had documented throughout the night would give way to daytime temperatures that were still brutally cold, but insufficient to maintain the specific chemical reactions they had observed. It was designed this way, Kolyakov explained to his students as they collected their final measurements. The ancient artisans understood the astronomical cycle. They knew that under the specific angle of the full moon, at these particular temperatures, the pigment would activate. It was a timing mechanism, a way to ensure that anyone who found the idol under the right conditions would recognize it as significant. It was communication across millennia. Dmitri was examining the symbols with new understanding, adding annotations to his sketches. "It's a calendar marker, isn't it? Not just decoration. The people who created this understood that the moon has cycles, that human knowledge needed to be refreshed periodically. Perhaps they came to this location once per generation, during the full moon, to verify that their history was intact, their knowledge preserved. A library," the young graduate student said, wonder in her voice. "An open-air archive, a way to pass knowledge from generation to generation without written language, without vulnerable materials that could be destroyed." Mikhail stood apart from the group, watching the false dawn light illuminate the eastern sky. He had been thinking about his grandfather, about why the old man had discovered this place and then maintained silence for 50 years. The answer was becoming clear. It wasn't that grandfather didn't want to share the discovery. It was that he understood something more profound, that some knowledge is meant to remain incomplete, that some places are sacred precisely because they are not understood, that mystery itself has value. "We need to make decisions," Mikhail said quietly. The others turned to listen. "About what happens next, about whether we speak of this, publish findings, allow others to know. Kolyakov set down his instruments. I've spent 30 years studying the Chulim civilization through fragments and folklore. This idol represents an opportunity to understand an entire lost culture. But you are right. There are consequences to revelation. The location would become a target for tourism, for removal by collectors, for all the destructive forces that follow once a secret is revealed. My grandfather understood that. Mikhail continued. I think that's why he told no one. Not out of selfishness, but out of protection. He was protecting the idol, protecting the place, protecting the culture it represented from being consumed and exploited. The young graduate student, her name was Katya, spoke hesitantly. But couldn't we publish the findings without coordinates? Share what we learned about ancient chemical knowledge, about astronomical understanding, without actually revealing where to find this. Dmitri considered this. Academic work without specific evidence. It would lack credibility. Other archaeologists would dismiss it as speculation, as they have dismissed my work for 30 years, Kolyakov said with resignation. I have published papers about the Chulim civilization, about their astronomical knowledge, and they are treated as fringe scholarship. Few take them seriously, but perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some civilizations are meant to remain partially mysterious. Otherwise, we reduce them to museum pieces and tourist attractions. Mikhail made a decision. He removed the sample containers from his pack, the tiny fragments of ancient pigment carefully preserved. We keep the documentation, photographs, measurements, analysis, all of it. But we store it carefully, separately, perhaps distributed so that it cannot be easily destroyed or seized. And we do not reveal location. We speak of the discovery only in the most general terms, if we speak of it at all. He looked directly at Kolyakov. If you publish the science of what we found, the ancient chemistry, the astronomical knowledge, the proof that pre-literate civilizations understood principles we thought were only rediscovered in recent centuries, but no coordinates, no map, no way for anyone to actually locate this place. Kolyakov nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what was being offered. I accept these terms. I will spend the rest of my career validating this discovery through research and analysis, building the case for the sophistication of Chulim civilization. But I will do so protecting the sacred place itself. That is an honor I did not expect to receive. The brothers retrieved their climbing equipment and began preparing for the descent. The scholars would follow a different route, one they had established during their approach. The two groups would separate, maintain distance, preserve the mutual agreement that this discovery belonged to the mountain itself, not to human ambition or ego. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. As Mikhail prepared his rope for the descent, he felt something shift inside him. His grandfather had carried this burden, this knowledge of a magnificent discovery that could not be shared, for 50 years. He and Dmitri would carry it for their own lifetimes. Kolyakov would carry it through his research. The idol would continue to wait, continuing its ancient vigil, bleeding under the full moon for witnesses who were meant to find it. Some knowledge, Mikhail understood now, was not meant to be spread. Some wisdom was in the keeping of silence. Some value existed precisely in remaining hidden. The descent was treacherous in ways the ascent had not been, not because the mountain had become more dangerous, but because exhaustion had begun to claim the brothers' bodies, and the light had returned. In darkness, on technical terrain, climbers rely on precise understanding of their position. In daylight, the illusion of security often leads to carelessness. Mikhail and Dmitri forced themselves to move slowly, to maintain the same discipline that had gotten them to the summit. Behind them, they could hear the distant voices of Kolyakov's group, making their descent on the opposite face. The mountain was large enough that multiple expeditions could share it without direct contact. but the knowledge of each group's presence remained, a silent collaboration, a mutual agreement that transcended language or written contract. As they descended through the afternoon, the temperature climbed incrementally. By the time they reached the camp where they had staged their assault on the upper slopes, the cold had become merely brutal rather than life-threatening. They rested briefly, consumed hot water and energy rations, and prepared for the final push down the lower slopes to base camp. It was during this rest that Mikhail's satellite communicator buzzed with a message. He checked it with growing alarm. The message was from their lawyer, a follow-up communication about the sale of their grandmother's house. The documentation had been completed. The house belonged to someone else now. Within a week, a development company planned to begin renovations. The attic, Dmitri said, reading over his shoulder. Everything grandfather left in the attic will be discarded, Mikhail finished. The realization hit them both with particular force. In their focus on the discovery and the climb, they had not thought about what this meant. The house was no longer theirs. The hidden space that had protected their grandfather's journal and photographs for decades would be demolished, renovated, erased. "We need to go back," Dmitri said suddenly, with urgency. "We need to retrieve everything. The journal, the photographs, the samples he kept." "We will," Mikhail said calmly. "Tomorrow. But tonight we descend. We get to base camp safely. That is the priority." But inside, Mikhail was processing a deeper understanding. Their grandfather had not kept the location secret because he wanted to forget the idol. He had kept it secret because he was preserving something that could not be preserved any other way. The moment they published, the moment they revealed, the moment they tried to institutionalize or protect the discovery through official channels, it would be lost. Committees would squabble, bureaucrats would seize it, collectors would mount expeditions to remove it. Their grandfather had understood that the only real protection was obscurity. They completed their descent to base camp as the sun was setting, painting the Siberian landscape in shades of amber and deep purple. The camp was exactly as they had left it, untouched, anonymous, speaking nothing of the profound events that had occurred on the slopes above. Mikhail and Dmitri spent that night in their tent, unable to sleep fully, but needing rest. They discussed practical matters in quiet voices. They would retrieve everything from their grandmother's house tomorrow. They would digitize the journal, create encrypted backups of all their documentation. They would live their normal lives, Mikhail in Moscow, Dmitri in his surveying work, while carrying the knowledge like a secret gift held in trust. They would not forget what they had seen. They would not forget the idol under the full moon, the ancient pigment responding to chemistry. Ancient artisans had somehow formulated the symbols on the base that recorded the history of a civilization lost to time. They would not forget Dr. Kolyakov or Katya's wonder at understanding that pre-literate peoples could possess such sophisticated knowledge, but they would protect it. That was their inheritance from their grandfather, their responsibility to the mountain and the idol and the memory of people who had carved it millennia ago. As they lay in the darkness, listening to the Siberian wind outside their tent, Mikhail thought about his grandfather one more time, about the choice to remain silent, about the courage it must have taken to carry such knowledge alone, to keep it from the world, to trust that eventually, in the future, after he was gone, others would find it and understand. The choice had been validated. The idol had waited, and in its waiting it had preserved not just itself, but something more valuable, the proof that human civilization was far older, far more sophisticated than the historical record acknowledged. Mikhail and Dmitri returned to Moscow in a state of controlled urgency. Their grandmother's house was scheduled for demolition to begin in 6 days. Everything that wasn't preserved or removed would be destroyed. They informed their lawyer that they needed access to the property one final time to collect personal items. Permission was granted without significant resistance. The attic was colder than they remembered, the winter air seeping through ventilation gaps. They worked methodically, photographing every section, then carefully cataloguing everything they found. The leather journal was there, undisturbed. The photographs, including the precious images of the idol taken in 1967, were carefully preserved in acid-free storage that had protected them for decades. And there was more than they had initially found. In a hidden compartment beneath the loose floorboards, they discovered letters, dozens of them, addressed to unknown future discoverers, but never sent. Their grandfather had continued to document his thoughts about the idol for years after his initial expedition. He had recorded theories about the ancient pigment formula, observations about the astronomical alignments that made the monthly revealing effect possible, and most importantly, reflections on why he had chosen silence. One passage, written in 1995, stood out to Mikhail as he read, "The world consumes mysteries. It demands explanations, classifications, institutional ownership. To reveal this place would be to destroy it." I leave these words not as guidance for exhibition, but as permission for whoever finds this place again to understand that my silence was not cowardice. It was protection. The idol does not need to be shared. It needs to remain. And those who find it will understand, as I now understand, that knowledge retained in humility is more powerful than knowledge broadcast to the world. The brothers spent the entire day in that attic, photographing, digitizing, creating backups. By evening, they had captured everything. The physical documents would remain in their care, stored securely, backed up digitally in multiple locations. As they left the house, really left it knowing they would never return to this space where their grandfather had worked as a surveyor, where he had begun the journey that led him to the idol, Mikhail felt the weight of inheritance settle on his shoulders more fully. They were now the keepers of something transcendent. Not the idol itself, that belonged to the mountain, protected by isolation and obscurity, but the knowledge of it, the documentation, the story. Dmitri spoke as they locked the front door. "What do we do with what we have? Eventually, we'll need to preserve it properly. Archives fail, houses burn, digital systems are vulnerable to deletion or hacking. We make multiple copies," Mikhail said. "We give backups to people we trust. We live our lives normally, but we know this is here, waiting. Perhaps someday, decades from now, when the world has changed, when technology has evolved, when we're both old, we'll make the decision about revelation. Or perhaps we'll pass the responsibility to others who understand that some knowledge is meant to be held in sacred silence." They drove back to Moscow in darkness, carrying backpacks with multiple hard drives and carefully organized documentation. Mikhail watched the Siberian landscape fade into the distance and thought about time itself, how 50 years had passed between his grandfather's discovery and his own, how perhaps another 50 years or 100 years might pass before humanity was ready to understand what the idol represented. The months that followed settled into routine. Mikhail returned to his financial analysis work. Dmitri continued his surveying expeditions. But both brothers lived differently now, carrying the knowledge like a second consciousness. They maintained contact with Dr. Kolyakov, who sent occasional emails discussing his ongoing research into Chulim civilization. The academic work was advancing, slowly building a case for the sophistication of pre-literate cultures, without ever directly referencing the idol or its location. One evening, Dmitri called Mikhail with news. Kolyakov had published a groundbreaking paper on ancient chemical knowledge in pre-literate Siberian cultures. The work was gaining traction in academic circles, challenging assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of societies without written language. It was being discussed seriously now, no longer dismissed as fringe speculation. "He's doing it," Dmitri said with something like wonder. He's validating the discovery without revealing it. The world will eventually understand that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we thought, and no one will know why, but the knowledge will be embedded in human understanding. That was grandfather's vision, Mikhail replied. He understood that sometimes the most profound legacy is invisible. Years passed. Mikhail turned 40, then 45. Dmitri moved into project management, overseeing large surveying expeditions across Russia and neighboring countries. Their daily lives continued their practical trajectories, but underneath ran a current of deeper knowledge, a secret that had transformed them both fundamentally. Then one evening in November, almost exactly 10 years after their initial climb, Mikhail received an encrypted email from Kolyakov. The message was brief. "She's ready to go. Katya has enough documentation. It's happening next month." Mikhail understood immediately. Katya, the graduate student who had been with them that night under the full moon, had completed her doctoral dissertation. It was titled Ancient Chemical Ingenuity, Evidence of Sophisticated Formulation Practices in Pre-Literate Siberian Cultures. It presented detailed analysis of pigment compounds, their thermal properties, their reactive potential under specific conditions. It demonstrated that ancient peoples had possessed knowledge of chemistry and materials, science that predated written scientific methodology by thousands of years. The dissertation did not mention the idol. It did not include location data. But anyone with the knowledge and resources to pursue the research would eventually be able to piece together where that knowledge had been applied. The work was both protection and revelation. It preserved the profound discovery while allowing the importance of that discovery to enter human academic consciousness. Mikhail attended the dissertation defense in person. He sat in the back of the lecture hall and watched Katya present her research. She was brilliant, elegant, precise. She stood before a committee of senior professors and systematically dismantled the assumption that civilization and sophistication required written language. She demonstrated through chemistry and materials analysis that the cultures of ancient Siberia had understood principles that Western science would not discover until centuries later. When she finished, one of the senior professors asked the inevitable question, "Dr. Mendeleev, what inspired this unusual research direction? Most scholars approach Siberian prehistory from archaeological or anthropological angles, not chemical." Katya smiled. She was careful not to look at Mikhail in the audience. "I was privileged to participate in fieldwork that revealed the complexity of ancient formulations. It became clear to me that these cultures didn't develop their knowledge in isolation. They developed it systematically through observation and experimentation. They deserve to be recognized as sophisticated scientists, even if their science was expressed through different channels than our own." The defense was approved unanimously. Katya's dissertation would become part of the academic record, preserved in university archives and eventually published for scholarly distribution. The knowledge had been released into the world in its protected form. The mysterious origin of that knowledge would remain mysterious, but the profound implications would ripple through academic understanding. That night, Mikhail stood alone on the balcony of his Moscow apartment, watching the city lights spread beneath him. He thought about his grandfather, carrying the secret across 50 years of silence. He thought about himself and Dmitri, continuing that work of protection, that decision to preserve mystery rather than exploit revelation. He thought about the idol, sitting on its peak in the Siberian mountains, bleeding red tears under the full moon, waiting for the next witness who would find it, understand it, and face the same choice. The world had changed since his grandfather's time. Digital information could be copied infinitely, shared instantly, preserved across servers and devices. Yet the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Some knowledge was more valuable when protected. Some mysteries gave meaning to the world precisely because they remained unsolved. Mikhail received a message from Dmitri on his phone. "I've decided to return to the mountain, not to the idol, I'll leave that untouched, but to the general region. I want to conduct a surveying expedition, officially, that will map and protect the area. If it becomes recognized as a significant natural landmark, it might receive some legal protection, some official preservation status. It won't stop determined climbers, but it might deter casual tourism." Mikhail understood the wisdom of this. Dmitri was creating a protective layer through bureaucracy, using official systems to defend the sacred place. It was elegant and practical. "When?" Mikhail typed back. "Next year, early spring. The mountain will be less accessible, but I want to be there to see it again, to remember why grandfather made the choice he did." Mikhail smiled. Some stories end in revelation, some stories end in preservation, and some of the most profound stories are those that transform the people who encounter them, rippling through their lives like invisible currents, shaping their choices, their values, their understanding of what it means to be a steward of knowledge. The idol would continue to wait. The ancient pigment would continue to react under the specific alignment of moon and cold and chemistry that its creators had so deliberately engineered. And the brothers and the scholars and eventually, someday, others would continue to find this place, face this mystery, and make their own decisions about whether to share, preserve, protect, or remain silent. In keeping the secret, they had become part of something larger than themselves. They had honored the memory of people lost to time. They had respected the vision of their grandfather, and they had recognized the simple truth that lay at the heart of all true discovery. Some things are sacred not despite their hiddenness, but because of it. The bleeding stone waited on the mountain. The full moon would rise again, and somewhere, someone would eventually climb to find it, as seekers had before, and as seekers would again, guided by coincidence and circumstance, and the simple human drive to understand the mysteries that shape the earth beneath our feet. The cycle would continue, the knowledge would remain, and in that preservation of mystery, the true treasure would endure. In the high Siberian mountains, beyond maps and beyond easy reach, an idol carved from grey stone continues its ancient vigil. Under the full moon, when temperature drops to specific thresholds and moisture rises from the glacial ice, ancient pigment responds. Red-tinged liquid seems to weep from eyes that have not blinked for millennia. No one knows exactly how old it is. The cultures that created it have been lost to history, their names forgotten, their language dissolved into silence. But they left a message written in stone and chemistry, a message that said, "We were here, we were sophisticated. We understood the cosmos and the materials of this world, and we left this as proof, hidden where only those patient enough to search would find it." The brothers who discovered it are now middle-aged, carrying the knowledge lightly, as one carries a precious secret that grows lighter with time because it has been fully accepted. Their grandfather's prophecy proved true. Silence protected the place more effectively than any amount of published revelation could have. And the scholarship continued, building slowly, creating a new understanding of human capability and the depth of ancient wisdom. The world began to comprehend that civilization was older, more complex, more brilliant than previously understood. But the source of that new understanding remained mysterious, attributed to research and theory rather than to a bleeding stone on a Siberian peak. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.